Welcome today to the Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Feasibility Study, public meeting number 2. So a little bit of what you can expect during this meeting. We do want to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. First off, we will have a presentation portion of the meeting, and then we will go into the question and answer portion of the meeting. During the presentation, your video and chat will be disabled. And that is actually going to be throughout the entire meeting. Microphones will also be muted throughout the meeting until we get to the Q&A portion. So you can submit your Q&A at any time during the presentation. You'll see the blue arrow there pointing to the Q&A feature that you can find on your navigation bar on Zoom. That's where you can type in your questions at any point during the presentation, and then we will get to those during the question and answer session. If you want to ask a question out loud, you can raise your hand once we get to the question and answer portion of the meeting, and we will call on you and give you the ability to unmute yourself. But you're also welcome to continue using the Q&A feature during the question and answer portion of the meeting. All right, and now I will hand it off to Jen DeBrule, our Chief of Public Transportation at DRPT.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join us this evening for the second public meeting on this Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Feasibility Study. I'm Jen DeBrule, I'm the Chief of Public Transportation at DRPT. I'm joined by Todd Horsley, who manages our Northern Virginia transit programs, Sarah Williams, who's our NOVA transit planning manager, and Randy Selleck in our rail team, who's the planning and environmental manager. Also, we have our wonderful consultant team. They're doing a great job on the study. Tom Harrington and Dahlia Levin from Cambridge Systematics. So you'll hear from them a little bit later this evening. Diana Barretto from PRR, and the team at PRR has been fantastic in managing our communications. Sue Knapp from KFH Group, and Yolanda Takasian from Kittleson and Associates. So very grateful to have such a strong team working on this study. We can go to the next slide. What we're going to do this evening is give you a brief introduction about the study to make sure everybody has that background information that we shared in the first public meeting. We're going to talk about the survey that was conducted earlier this spring, the preliminary alternatives that were considered or are being considered as part of the study, and the preliminary results of the evaluation of those alternatives, along with the next steps. And as Diana stated, we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation this evening. Thank you. So I'm going to give you the background of on the study and turn it over to Tom and Dahlia. So in 2020, there was language in the budget that directed DRPT to conduct a feasibility study. The language out of the budget is there on the screen for you, but basically we are looking at enhanced public transportation services, basically from the Franconia Springfield metro station area to Fort Belvoir, Lorton, Potomac Mills, and the Marine Corps Base Quantico in Prince William County. That budget language did direct us to look at the feasibility of extending the Blue Line, but also to look at other multimodal options, including bus rapid transit along I-95 and Route 1. Our study is due to be completed by December 1st of this year and submitted to the General Assembly at that time. And in doing so, we're going to look at a range of multimodal transit investments that we'll be walking you through this evening. Next slide. In terms of outcomes, we are, this is a feasibility study. And so in doing that, we are doing a comprehensive and an objective evaluation of the feasibility of a range of different potential enhanced transit alternatives in the corridor. The outcome of that analysis will help inform recommendations made in future studies about future investment in the corridor based on 3 factors: looking at cost, looking at the benefits of those transit alternatives, and also the impacts of the transit alternative. So our study area is following the I-95 and Route 1 corridors as was outlined in the budget amendment. you'll see that we've drawn basically a box around those from the Potomac River all the way to just west of I-95. We found logical points to follow in drawing that study area boundary. One thing that I want to caution everybody on is this is the area that we're looking at specific potential transit improvements within this study area boundary. But in evaluating our potential transit investments, we are looking at all of the traffic in the region, whether it is originating from outside of the study area, traveling through the study area completely, or having a destination beyond the study area. So we're using regional modeling. We have that broad perspective. So while we're looking at improvements within the study area, we definitely have the broader view in terms of the traffic and the traffic needs and travel needs in this particular area of Prince William and Fairfax County. Some of the key issues that we're looking at with this study is existing and future demand for transit, plans that are either in place now or are being contemplated for transit supportive development. We're looking at the trends in transit ridership and telecommuting. That's obviously something that's been a big topic over the past year or so. We're looking at the capital and operating costs of any potential alternatives that we would potentially consider for feasibility in the study. We're looking at other planned transportation improvements, access to the military bases at Fort Belvoir and Quantico, and also overall Metro rail system capacity, because the Metro is a large system, and any extension into southern Fairfax and Prince William County would obviously have impacts on the overall system and system capacity. So lots of issues under consideration and going into the evaluation of potential transit improvements in this corridor. So with that, I'm going to turn the platform over to Tom Harrington, who's going to start with briefing on the technical approach. Tom?
Thanks, Jen. I'll start with a overview intro to the study. So this chart shows our overall approach to the study. In the first stage of the project, we began developing a project needs statement to answer the question, which transportation problems or conditions are we trying to address? In the next stage of the project, we began to define a set of transit alternatives that would best address those needs. And we've recently completed the initial testing and evaluation of the transit alternatives. And that's the focus of tonight's presentation, the first cut at the test and evaluate alternatives. In parallel with our work examining transit alternatives, the study team is considering the existing and planned land use in the corridor and how they might change if high capacity transit is expanded in the corridor. So while our initial model test used the currently expected land use in the corridor, we plan to do a second round of model tests that will consider how the transit options would perform with increased land use density near station areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, based on the results of the evaluation, we'll develop a set of study recommendations that summarize findings on benefits, costs, and impacts. All right. And so this study schedule gives you an overview, and this is our second public meeting, which aligns with that second blue bar for public input here in July. Today's meeting will present initial work on the testing, basically, as I think Jen mentioned, the study's final report will go to the General Assembly December 1st. We do have a project website that's hosted on the DRPT website, and you can find additional resources on the project at that location. We do plan to have one more round of public meetings later in September. So that'll be another opportunity to get your voice heard in the study process. Okay. So from April to May, the team conducted a survey. We're going to talk a little bit about the results of that. So the survey, the objectives of the survey were to gain an understanding of the regional and local corridor use of travel within the corridor, both pre and post-pandemic. We looked at travel behavior before, and we asked people how they would travel after the pandemic. And we also talked more specifically about how different transit alternatives could best serve the needs of corridor users. As noted here, we had over 1,300 people that took the survey. And of those who responded to the survey, 54% live in Prince William County and 32% live in Fairfax County. I should note that the survey was not based on random sample recruitment of the population. Therefore, the results are not statistically valid representative sample, but rather are a reflection of the participants that took the survey. And so tonight we're presenting some highlights of the survey results, and the full survey report is available on the DRPT website. The survey asked a series of questions about travel in the corridor, and specifically differentiated between travel before COVID and travel that people are expecting after COVID. So as noted here, in terms of those who responded to the survey, we asked, please tell us how you typically traveled in the study corridor for work before the COVID pandemic. And of the people that responded, the top responses were drive alone, Metrorail and VRE commuter rail, as well as bus. It should be noted that more than one mode could be selected, so these don't add up to 100%. And it also is apparent from this that the corridor has a number of different travel modes that are available. You'll note also unique to this corridor is slugging mode, which had 16%, and that's sometimes called casual carpool, where people take advantage of carpooling in order to get on the HOV lanes. When asked where respondents work or worked before COVID, top responses, as shown here, were in basically the region's core. So Washington, DC, Arlington, Alexandria being the top answers. Traveling for work fully within the study area was less common. That was 6% of the people that responded to the survey. Other parts of the survey, when we looked at the impact of COVID, did show that more people are working from home during the pandemic, as expected, and that people do expect to be working from home more after the pandemic, but generally to return to pre-COVID travel patterns after the pandemic. So when asked, what are the top 3 features that would motivate you to use or to use more often public transit for your trips along the study corridor? The top responses in terms of motivators for using transit were easier access to transit at 51%, shorter trip time, 45%, and other top answers were extending the service hours, so say into evenings and weekends, having on-time arrivals and departures, in other words, making transit more reliable, having one card that can pay fares across modes, which will make it easier to transfer between different modes, and making transit more affordable. So that gives us an idea of some of the factors that people are considering in terms of what would allow them to use transit more often. Next. And then we also asked the respondents to think about prioritizing the budget for transportation improvements in the corridor, and asked sort of what % should be spent on different transit options. And many of these options, these mirror the types of alternatives that we're looking at in the corridor. The average responses or percentages are shown next to each option. And so the top priorities for transportation improvements for the folks that responded to the survey included an extension of the Metrorail system. The average was 50% for that. More frequent VRE commuter rail service in both directions was next. And then we also had some of the bus options as well that are shown here, but the 2 rail options definitely had higher percentages as a share, but express bus, more frequent local bus, and BRT were the other options that we asked about. Okay, and when we asked for your preferred type of transit, so the one that we just asked about on the previous question, what do you expect would be the purpose of your trips along the study corridor during weekdays? And work is the most common trip purpose for all types of enhanced transit. And so there were some non-work trip purposes that are cited here, a real mix for most types of transit. I think with the exception of the express bus that uses the I-95 express bus lanes, where work was definitely the clear favorite in terms of the trip purpose there. We also asked about what would be your top or likely destinations within the study area using enhanced transit. And so some of the top destinations in the study area, and these were pretty consistent for all types of transit, included Franconia Springfield, Woodbridge, Potomac Mills, Fort Belvoir were the top four. And then you can see some of the other key activity centers in the area are also listed. We also asked the survey respondents where they would travel to outside of the study corridor using enhanced transit. And again, we see that the trips to the core of the region, to Washington, to Alexandria, to Arlington, were the top responses, with smaller shares going to suburban destinations such as Tysons or Reston. Okay, next I'm going to hand it off to Dahlia, and she's going to discuss the different alternatives that we tested.
Thank you, Tom. So we have looked at a couple of different alternatives, 5, and we built these and designed them based on conversations that we had with the public back at our last public meeting. So this slide might look a little familiar if you joined us earlier in the spring, but also based on some of the results of that survey that Tom was just talking about. So looking at all of the different activity centers, the possible destinations, places where people live in the corridor and where they might be going, we've developed 5 preliminary alternatives that we've looked at as part of this phase of analysis. And so we'll start off by looking at what those are. Some of these might look a little familiar, again, if you joined us last time. But what we're looking at are some potential improvements. And the first 3 are going to be sort of major capital improvements, right? Expansions to the existing transit system. So you can see here, this is a potential extension of the blue line. So it would come south from Franconia Springfield, hit the Fort Belvoir North area, come through Newington, join Route 1 at Fort Belvoir to make sure we serve the base there, come down south to Lorton, follow Route 1 into Prince William County to hit North Woodbridge. And then we want to make sure that we're serving the Potomac Mills area. So we have a number of stations there. And then continuing down towards the southern end of this corridor with stations at Southbridge and at Triangle. So this was our first extension, which I'll refer to throughout the rest of the presentation as the blue line alternative, to distinguish it from the other Metro Rail extension alternative that we looked at, which was a very similar extension of the yellow line. So this, instead of coming down from Franconia Springfield, would extend the yellow line down from the Huntington station. This would be running in parallel to the planned Richmond Highway BRT in this area, but we'd be looking at stations at Beacon Hill Road, at High Bluff Valley, and then at Fort Belvoir. And then the rest of the station locations and actually the routing for this alternative are very similar to what we saw for the blue line. So there would be 10 stations, almost all of them except the ones on bases would have parking. And we'd be looking at frequencies of around 8 minutes during the peak, 12 minutes during the off peak, in line with what the rest of the Metro Rail system is running. And that would be true for both of those Metro Rail alternatives. The other sort of major investment we took a look at is the opportunity to run bus rapid transit, or BRT, along this corridor. And so, as I mentioned, there is already planned and programmed for the Richmond Highway BRT to extend along the Route 1 corridor through that northern portion of of Fairfax County. Sorry for that. And what this alternative would do is extend that BRT through the rest of southern Fairfax County, through Prince William County, all the way down to Triangle. So again, this does follow a similar alignment, but keeping in mind that we have to keep BRT on roads. So we're looking again through Lorton, through Potomac Mills, down south, as far south as Triangle. Because it's BRT, we are able to put in a lot more stations. So you can see a lot more places where the BRT would stop than with the Metro Rail alternatives. We also looked at two potential alternatives that were a bit more on the scale of a bit more incremental, a bit more on the scale of operational improvements to existing transit services. So the first one is we looked at some potential service enhancements to the VRE system, and so to the Fredericksburg line that runs here through our corridor. And this was really looking at some additional service improvements. And I want to be very clear that this is above and beyond what's already being planned for improvements on VRE. So there's a lot of improvements already planned for VRE as part of the Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative. But we would be adding some additional peak service in both directions. So providing service both up into DC and then southbound during the peak periods into Fairfax, Prince William, and even as far south as Stafford and Fredericksburg. So there would be that reverse peak direction service as well. There would be additional evening and midday service to provide those all-day connections, but there would be no new stations above what's already planned. So it would be very much just some enhancement to the service along this corridor. And we would improve it along the entire line, as I mentioned. So not just within our corridor, but all the way down south. The last alternative we looked at was also looking at potentially using buses. And this was really focusing on what enhancements could be made to the express bus service that is currently operated by both counties, by PRTC and by Fairfax County. What improvements could be made here to both provide faster connections to some of the key destinations, but also to expand connections between some of the destinations that people might want to go. So you can see there's about, I think it's 5 routes that we would be adding that would connect some different places along our corridor to some of the more not necessarily to DC, right? So right now, a lot of the express bus services in the corridor serve primarily the Pentagon and DC. So we would be providing some connections to Reston, to City of Fairfax, to some other locations in Alexandria, in particular out to Tyson's, which has some demand to it, and then also providing a strong connection between Fort Belvoir in Fairfax County and the Marine base Quantico in Prince William County. And we also took some of the existing routes and said, well, we can improve service on these. So increase the frequency, make sure there's additional service so that folks can go get where they want to go faster and with less wait time. So those are the 5 alternatives that we looked at for this preliminary analysis. I do want to point out though, and I would be remiss if I didn't, the sheer length of distance that we're talking about for these alternatives. So what you can see here is sort of our existing metro system are these solid colored lines. And you can see currently our longest line is just under 18 miles. That goes out to Shady Grove along the red line. And it's 18 miles from, we'll say, the center of the system, if we call that L'Enfant Plaza, because that's where my house is. But so that's roughly 18 miles as the crow flies, and about 19 miles on the train itself. Of course, the Silver Line out to Ashburn is currently under construction, and that is going to be a longer line. So that would be 26.7 miles to get to my house, and 32 miles on the track. So that is a significantly longer piece of the transit system. But even considering that, our blue line and potential yellow line alternatives are very long alternatives. So if we're talking about all the way up from Triangle, that's 29 miles as the crow flies, but up to 46 miles for the blue line and 37 miles for the yellow line of track. So just keeping in mind the distance and therefore the time associated with it that people would need in order to make these trips on a Metro Rail extension, on a BRT extension. These are very long trips that folks are having to make. And the reason that's important is we want to take a look at how, as Jen mentioned earlier, how feasible are these options? How well do they perform? And should the counties, should the state consider investing in any of these alternatives? So we've done some work on preliminary evaluation results. There's more to come and much more detail, but I'm going to talk as briefly as I know how about some of the key metrics that we've been looking at. And so the important thing, we wanted to highlight is that there's multiple goals for transit. And, Jen talked about the different issues we're trying to deal with. And so we also have a number of different goals we're trying to achieve simultaneously. And so we've talked about these a little bit before as well. But one of the big ones, of course, is ridership potential. Does our enhanced transit actually attract riders? Do people want to use it? Is it a good investment in that respect? We also want to talk about congestion mitigation, because we cannot talk about this corridor without talking about the fact that there is major traffic congestion on the roads. So are we able to decrease the amount of traffic, the amount of congestion that drivers are going to continue to face on a daily basis? We also really want to focus on providing equitable solutions. So can we provide a fair distribution of costs and benefits across different groups and different communities within the corridor? Our fourth goal here is thinking about regional accessibility and connectivity. So can we provide better access to regional activity centers? Can we provide better access to jobs, economic, social opportunities for people who want to take advantage of them? We also want to look at cost effectiveness. So we want to make sure that our resources, our money, are used efficiently. So we're going to take a look at that. And then recognizing that major investments in transit can also have impacts on land use and development, and that those two things are tied very closely together. We also want to look at the development potential along the corridor that might be associated with these different enhanced transit alternatives. So I'm going to talk about a few metrics here. There's going to be some graphs, and it's going to be fun. So the first one we'll talk about is total transit boardings. So a boarding is a technical term that is essentially counted every time someone gets on a new transit vehicle. So we're looking at the number of times people get on a transit vehicle inside our study corridor in this graph. And we've got it broken down by a number of different modes. But what you can see here is that our BRT alternative has the highest number of transit boardings in the study corridor. We also see strong boardings for both of the Metro Rail extensions. And we see that all of the alternatives are actually higher in the number of transit boardings than the no build, or the version in which we don't build any of these alternatives. I do want to stress again, we talked about this a little, that the majority of the ridership increase is associated with the Transforming Rail in Virginia service improvements. So the major investment that the state is making in rail in this corridor have already been included in the no build. So you can actually see that in this table is that we're showing between the existing and that no build condition, we're seeing an 82% increase in boardings on VRE in the study corridor. But that under the VRE alternative, we're just seeing a little more incremental improvement above that. And that's primarily because the improvement we're talking about for VRE is more incremental in nature, right? It's an improvement in service levels as compared to some of the other alternatives that we talked about. And I'll also point out that the VRE alternative is a little bit unique in that we improved services well outside of the study corridor, right? We improved service along the entirety of the Fredericksburg line. And what that can do is mean that there are some additional boardings that are happening on VRE that just might not be in our study corridor, right? They might be happening further south in Stafford County and in the city of Fredericksburg. And coming home, they might be further north. They might be happening at L'Enfant Plaza. They might be happening at Franconia Springfield. So there's there are some that can happen outside of the corridor as well. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that. The next couple of slides, I'm going to focus on the three really heavy build alternatives that we talked about and where their ridership is happening. So this is looking at ridership potential along this, the purple everywhere is going to be for that BRT alternative. So you can see our highest ridership is up north, Beacon Hill, Hydla Valley, South County, in Fairfax County. We're also seeing fairly strong ridership in the Potomac Mills area, at Potomac Mills, at Marumsco. There are a couple of stations with fairly low ridership. And in particular, those are a little bit down south. Triangle, Town of Dumfries have fairly low ridership. Again, the ridership here is going to be spread out over a large number of stations because we do have so many of them in this alternative. Looking at that blue line alternative that we talked about, we can see that our strongest ridership is at the far north end of the corridor. So Franconia Springfield continues to be a station with heavy ridership. But we also see strong ridership at the Fort Belvoir North station and at North Woodbridge in Prince William County. We have relatively steady ridership the rest of the route, but there are some stations with low ridership south of Potomac Town Center. So in particular, the Triangle station continues to show very low ridership in this alternative as well. And the last one we'll look at in this level of detail is that yellow line extension. So here again, we're seeing very strong ridership in the north part of Fairfax County, where we're along the Route 1 corridor. Beacon Hill, Hydla Valley, very strong ridership. North Woodbridge, also very strong ridership. And there's good ridership through Lorton, through the other Potomac Mills stations. But again, south of Potomac Town Center, ridership drops off significantly as we saw in the other alternatives. So another way that we can talk about transit ridership potential is to talk about new transit trips. So you'll remember that I was talking about boardings being every time somebody gets onto a transit vehicle. A new transit trip is really counted end to end, right? So anytime we're causing a new person to take a transit trip where they weren't taking them before. So these could be folks who are shifting from their cars. These could be folks who weren't going anywhere because they didn't have access before. But these are new, entirely new transit trips that are happening in the corridor. So unlike boardings, where we're spurring the most new transit trips are here on the yellow line and the blue line. So the two Metro Rail alternatives do better under this metric than the BRT does. And you can also see we've got two different colors here. So the blue bars are trips that are generated from the study corridor. So the folks, for example, who might be starting their commute in the morning at home in the corridor and going up to DC, up to the Pentagon. But we're also looking at that red bar, which is trips that are coming to the study corridor. And that's folks who might live either inside or outside of the corridor, who would be coming into the corridor for work, for entertainment, for shopping, whatever that is. So on both of those measures, the Metro Rail yellow line alternative performs the best, but you can see that there is more of a balance on the BRT and even a little bit more on the blue line alternative. The last piece we always want to talk about when we're talking about ridership potential is thinking about the distance that folks are spending on those transit vehicles. And so we quantify that using a measure called person miles of travel. So it's the amount of miles people are moving on transit in our study corridor. And this is going to be a function of both how many people are riding transit and how long they're traveling for. So a longer distance trip is going to help weight this measure a little bit more heavily. So as you can see here, the Metro Rail alternatives are carrying more people for longer distances in the study corridor than the other alternatives. And that's because they do have fairly strong ridership, but also they carry longer distance trips in some sense than, say, the BRT, which seems to be being used for more shorter trips and more local trips. We want to shift then into talking about congestion mitigation as one of our goals. And so we measure this using something called vehicle miles travel. So this is VMT is the amount of travel that is done by cars in the study corridor. And so in this case, going down is generally better. So in all of our cases, all of our alternatives, VMT goes down compared to the no build, but generally by less than 2%. So it's not a lot. Now, this is a very busy graph in which it's very hard to read anything. So I'm going to switch it very quickly, and we're going to instead just talk about the amount of VMT that's happening that is congested. And so this is looking at just those two, the evil red and the slightly less evil red bars on that last graph, the severe congestion and the congestion. So again, lower here is better. And you can see that all of the alternatives are decreasing congestion on roads in the study corridor compared to the no build. But the two Metro Rail alternatives, and in particular the yellow line, perform the best on this metric. We've also talked about providing better accessibility and connectivity around the region. So we're looking at a metric of who is able to now walk to transit that may not have been before. So what we're looking at here is two bars. The red bars are population and the purple bars are employment. And both of these are for the future year of 2045, which is where we've been making these forecasts at, because it will take a while to get most of these on the ground. But so by 2045, the yellow line and the BRT alternatives will provide that high quality transit to the most residents in the region. So the yellow line is looking at over 70,000. The BRT is looking at over 60,000. But the blue line will have the most jobs within a half mile of transit. And that we believe is due to the fact that it is serving additional job centers around Newington and around Fort Belvoir North in Fairfax County. That is why we think that's happening. And so those are an interesting mix of results that we have here. But we want to not just think about who's able to walk to the transit stations. We also want to think about what can people get to, right? Providing access to opportunities. And so what we're looking at here is a metric that we call accessibility, but it's really focusing on how many jobs can the average resident of our corridor get to within 60 minutes by transit. And we use that because it's generally a reasonable travel time, although other thresholds can give you other insights. I'm only going to do this one tonight. So if we're going to talk about within 60 minutes to transit, we can see how much each of the alternatives improves the average person's access to jobs. So the yellow line alternative is performs the best on this metric. So there's an almost 18% increase here in the number of jobs that the average person can get to. And that's looking on the order of potentially 100,000 new jobs. And that's providing that faster access towards Alexandria, towards the Pentagon in Arlington, towards DC, so that more folks can get to more things within a reasonable amount of time on transit. The Metro Rail Blue Line is about a little less than half of that. So it's also doing good things for accessibility. And in fact, most of our alternatives are, but where you're able to open up new markets, so serve new stations, as you are with the Metro Rail options and the BRT options, you are able to improve that accessibility the most. I'll also say that the express bus doesn't show up here. And that's because the express buses tend to be very long routes and they tend to take a very long time. And so because they take a long time, they're not necessarily opening up new markets within that 60-minute threshold. But if we were to expand that, we might see different results here. We also want to talk about some of these metrics from an equity perspective. And so to do that, we're really focusing on what's called equity emphasis areas, which were developed by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or COG, and the Transportation Planning Board. And these are identified based on locations that have high concentrations of low-income residents and minority residents. So you can see those areas highlighted here in magenta. And so these are the areas that we're focusing on when we're talking about how well are we serving, how well are we providing equity with these potential alternatives. So the first metric we looked at here is similar to what we talked about for total new transit trips, is how many of those new transit trips that we're creating are from these equity emphasis areas. So how many of them are from these communities that we were just looking at? So across all the alternatives, what we have found is that the new trips from those EEAs, so from the equity emphasis areas, grow more at a higher rate than the overall study corridor. So we are, let's say, attracting more equity users to our transit alternatives than we are. So we have that focus as we need to. But you can see the yellow line had the most new transit trips. It also has the most new transit trips by those EEA residents. So it is doing that as well. And that is, again, a function of the area that it's riding through. Because you might remember from this map, which I'll pop up again, this section here, which is served by the yellow line and the BRT, it has a large concentration of those EEAs right there. The other metric we wanted to look at, and I just went over that, jobs accessibility, right? So how many jobs can the average person get to within an hour on transit? We also looked at that, how is that improving for the residents of those equity emphasis areas? So the blue bars are what we showed you just a few minutes ago, is how is everything growing for the average resident for the whole corridor. And those red bars are what is happening for those residents of the equity emphasis areas. So again, this is a place where we are improving accessibility to jobs, and jobs are economic opportunities. We are improving access to jobs for the residents of the equity emphasis areas more than we are the population as a whole. So we believe that helps us to improve equity in the community. And we are seeing the biggest increase, again, in that yellow line alternative. And the third equity-based measure that I'll talk about real quickly tonight is we talked about the walk access to transit, right? The number of people who can walk to transit within a half mile. So we've looked at that as well from an equity perspective. So of those people who are able to walk to transit, what percentage of them are residents of those equity emphasis areas. So here you can see that the residents near the BRT alternatives are more than 40% of them, more than 45% of them even, are residents of those EEAs, and therefore the most likely to be low income or minority. So we've got strong representation from those communities in the ridership there. The yellow line is just under 35%, and the blue line and the express bus options both between 20 and 25%. The last metric I'm going to present tonight is about cost efficiency. And so we've been looking at that total cost per transit boarding on the line. And again, you can see some differences here. We're incorporating capital costs, we're incorporating operating costs, but again, all of that is divided by the number of boardings. So where you have higher boardings, you're much more likely to have lower cost efficiency, which is a good thing. So on this graph, lower is better. And then I want to talk quickly so we can get to the question and answers about how we're going to be talking about that land use and the development potential. And so Tom talked a little bit earlier that we're going to want to look at what is the potential for development around some of these station areas, recognizing that changes in land use could dramatically impact ridership levels. And so we're looking at existing county small area plans, potential for additional transit-oriented development. And this hasn't been used for the results I just presented for these preliminary analyses, but when we come back in September, we will have some of this additional analysis. And so again, by way of reference, we want to take a look at what the existing densities around some of those potential metro rail stations that we looked at for the blue line and the yellow line alternatives here, and how do those existing densities compare to densities at other metro rail stations in the region. And so all of these rows showed in orange are the potential metro stations. So these are ones that showed up in the alternatives that we were just looking at, whereas the white ones are existing stations on the metro rail system. And so those at the top of this list have the lowest existing density. So you can see we do have some potential stations in our corridor that are quite low density, but we also have some that are higher density that compare favorably with other metro rail stations around the region. And so that's something we're going to want to continue to look at as well. And so our land use analysis will be focused on 8 stations in particular that we want to consider these questions for. So 2 in Fairfax County at Newington and Lorton, and then the remainder in Prince William County, 3 around the Potomac Mills area. So that'll definitely be a big focus, but want to look at North Woodbridge and then those potential station areas at Southbridge and Triangle as well. And so we'll be looking at, as we said, the potential for TOD in those areas, and then the impacts of any additional development on transit ridership in the study corridor. And so that is enough of the numbers for the meanwhile. I'll just talk very quickly about next steps. I just mentioned some additional analysis that we're going to be doing. And so that's going to be happening over the rest of the summer. Come September, we're going to be having an additional round of public meetings to share those results with you. We are hoping, fingers crossed, that we can do that in person instead of over Zoom. And then there will be, as was mentioned previously, final report come December. So that is all of our presentation. I will hand it back to, I think, Diana or Jen. Diana.
Yes. Thanks, Dahlia, for all of that great information. So we just want to remind folks, we did see a few questions come in through the Q&A feature. But once again, on screen here, you can see where to find the Q&A feature with that blue cursor arrow pointing at that. So if you have any questions that you would like to submit through the Q&A feature, please click on that and type in your question. And we will start taking some verbal questions here pretty shortly. So if you want to Raise your hand and ask the question verbally. You can see where the green cursor is showing you how to raise your hand. I do believe we have at least a couple folks, maybe one person calling in. So if you are on the phone only and want to raise your hand, since you cannot type in a question, you can press *9. Again, if you're calling in only and would like to raise your hand to ask a question, you can press *9. We will call on you and give you the ability to unmute, and to unmute, you can press *6. So we'll leave this on screen as we're going through Q&A so that folks can use these controls as needed. But now I'll send it over to Jen DeBrule to start our Q&A session.
Thanks, Diana. We've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to walk through those right now. So the first question is, does the BRT alternative assume mainly dedicated lanes or mixed traffic? And Dahlia, would you mind taking that one?
Sure. So I will say this is not an engineering or design study, so we have not gotten into all of the details. But for the assumption, we are assuming primarily dedicated lanes, but not the entire way. And those will have to be addressed at a later date if we pursue this particular option.
All right, thanks. So the next question is, why was a 4-track regional rail with 2 tracks exclusively for passenger rail between Alexandria and Quantico not considered as an alternative? And I will take that one. This particular feasibility study is looking at Metro and looking at Express Bus BRT. We are looking at some incremental improvements to VRE, but we're really building that transforming rail in Virginia concept, which is still obviously in development, into the baseline. And so while that is an active project that is in development, we wanted to leave it and let it do its thing and not really get into that analysis and the studies so we don't conflict with the projects that are in development. So obviously, the more that you can do to facilitate efficient passenger rail in the corridor, that's obviously going to help with passenger rail ridership, but that very specific and detailed alternative is not being considered as part of this particular study. I'll also take the next one. This is a great question. What are the capital costs, operational costs, and jurisdictional subsidy for each alternative? Actually, I can throw that over to Tom. That's something that we're still working on. But Tom, did you want to?
Just that's information that we're using. Yep, and that will be part of our final report. And as you saw, we did talk a little bit about cost effectiveness tonight.
Thanks. And obviously, in a feasibility study, those costs and in particular with the costs associated with any Metro rail alternative are going to be really important for the elected officials to look at in terms of determining feasibility and next steps. So we know that's an important part of the study, and it's part of the study that is yet to come. Does the BRT alternative include the Richmond Highway BRT in the analysis, or is the Richmond Highway BRT a part of the no build? Dahlia, do you want to take that one?
Yes. So the Richmond Highway BRT is included as part of the no build. And so our build is just the extension south of Fort Belvoir for the BRT alternative.
All right, next question, and this is a question looking for clarification on connections to Quantico. And so can you clarify which routes provide a direct connection to Quantico? It looks like the others are showing Triangle as the final destination. Dahlia, you want to take that one as well?
Sure. The only one that we have currently serving the base itself is the express bus alternative. But what we do want to assume there is that any of the alternatives that include a station at Triangle we'd want to include whether it's a circulator bus, whether it's some as yet unfinalized automated vehicle or automated bus, that there are those first mile, last mile connections onto the base. And so that's going to be true at Quantico. It's also going to be true for the assumptions at Fort Belvoir.
Okay, thank you. So the next question has to do with the Metro Rail extensions for both the blue and the yellow line. And Dahlia, you mentioned that both of those are significantly longer than the existing Metro line. Is there an opportunity for high-speed non-Metro trains between DC and the points on the study corridor at the southern end?
So we definitely are not looking at high-speed rail. I know there's other discussions about improving connections between DC and Richmond and potentially further south on that. But our alternatives are not looking at high-speed rail. We did, as we mentioned, look at improvements to the existing commuter rail service. But again, that was service levels, not transforming that into high-speed rail.
I'm going to kick the next question over to Tom, and this is a question about the survey respondents. And I think you mentioned that 54% were from Prince William and 32% were from Fairfax County. And the question is, where did the other 14% of the respondents, where do they live?
Yes. Well, lots of places. And again, if you want, I think we dropped the link to the survey in the chat, so you can go take a look at the survey report. But yeah, Stafford County was 6%. So that was one that there were a lot of respondents from. And then really just a smattering from different places like Arlington, Alexandria, Manassas, Fairfax City, Fredericksburg City. So we did have some areas outside of our study area where people did take the survey.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to throw the next question to you as well. And this is a question about how the location of the Amazon headquarters at National Landing impacts the evaluation of alternatives in this study corridor in terms of job opportunities and potential ridership.
Yeah, so you know, as mentioned, the land use assumptions for this initial set of tests are from the cooperative forecast that the region's transportation planning board put out. And so to the extent that those account for some of the changes related to Amazon, those would be accounted for in this study.
And I will admit that I don't know if they do or not, so that's something we can check on.
Yeah, it is very, very good, a good comment, and that's one of the challenges with studies like this is things evolve in terms of development and you know, potential job locations, and especially when there's a lot of growth like the Amazon project, the timing of when that last land use analysis for the long range plan was done, that's definitely come into play. All right, we have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to drop anything else in there, but we're going to answer these two questions and we'll start taking questions, verbal questions as well. So Dahlia, I'm going to send this question to you. When it comes to the potential of extending metro lines into Prince William County, what, if any, segments of the metro might be above ground versus below ground?
You're sending me a question that I don't have an answer to at all. We have, as I said, this is not an engineering study, and we have not done any analysis of what that might look like. I will say, for the purposes of sort of the rough planning level costing estimates that we're looking at, we're assuming above ground, just because it does actually tend to be cheaper than tunneling. But no decisions at all have been made about what would be best or what would be feasible from an engineering perspective at this time.
And the last question in the Q&A box is, would pursuing any of these options affect the expansion of the Long Bridge? So that's a very good question. The Long Bridge is a project that's already funded and in development, so it is ahead of all of the projects that are being considered as part of this study. So that, you know, by virtue of timing, that project, the extension of the Long Bridge is already committed and is assumed as part of the baseline. So it would not, a commitment, any commitment that would come to pursue any one of these options would come likely long after the expansion of the Long Bridge in terms of implementation. All right, so I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. Got one more popped in. Will the study address the need for an additional bridge over the Occoquan River? Dolly or Tom, do you want to take that one, or it may be the same answer we've provided already with some of the others?
I'm not sure if we're talking about a bridge for rail alternatives or if we would be talking about a bridge to expand the roadway capacity. In either instance, we have again not gone into the detailed engineering of what that would be. So if we are talking about say a rail bridge to get the blue or the yellow line across the Occoquan there, we have not gone into that level of detail, but that would need to be accounted for if that were going to happen.
And I will add that there was a quarter study that was done, finished about a year ago, that addressed the I-95 corridor in a multimodal fashion, but also looked at the highway, and that I believe, if I remember correctly, it was about $12 billion to expand the roadway, and it would still be congested. So if you're looking for specific information on more on the highway side or the highway in comparison to multimodal options, I would point you to that study, and I will try to drop a link to that in the chat as we transition to taking live questions. One more question would be in the chat, is it possible to open express bus lanes? Don't know that we've gotten to that level of analysis in the study, but certainly anytime you can separate bus traffic from regular traffic, that certainly makes them more efficient. Dahlia or Tom, I don't know if you want to jump in on that one as well.
The only thing I'll add is that where they are traveling on 95, in our alternatives, we were certainly assuming that they were making use of the existing express lanes or the planned express lanes, depending on where we're operating. So they would already have access to that. We did not look at it as on the surface streets quite as much. So we did not account for it on where they're traveling, say on the surface streets on Route 123 or what have you.
All right. Thank you. And that looks like that's the last of our questions in the Q&A box for now. Diana, I believe we may have some hands raised for some verbal questions. Can I hand that back over to you?
Absolutely. It looks like Mark, we have your hand raised and we will give you the ability to unmute. And you can go ahead now and click your unmute button to ask your question.
Hi, my question was related to the BRT alternative relative to dedicated lanes or mixed traffic. My general question was, is the assumption that you would be repurposing existing lanes or expanding the roadway so you would have the existing lanes plus BRT? I just bring this up because, based on what I've seen from the US 250 Broad Street repurposing in Richmond, that cost $85 million, where the planned BRT widening on Route 1 on the Richmond Highway is probably $1.1 billion. So I'm just trying to understand if there's any way to feasibly look at both concepts of how you would potentially look at a repurposing of lanes for dedicated BRT and then expanding and kind of show the deltas there. Because again, any road that is more than 4 lanes, I think is getting pretty expansive to support, smart growth planning. I think having an 8-lane corridor is kind of a disservice to, walkable communities in general. So just wanted you to consider that, as far as repurposing lanes that are already 6 lanes or expanding like you are doing with the Richmond Highway BRT. Thank you.
So I can answer insofar as what was looked at in the BRT alternative that we presented today. And that was not assuming that lanes were taken. So there wasn't at this point assumption of repurposing of lanes. You are absolutely correct. That would have an impact on cost. It would also have impacts on potentially ridership and congestion levels as well. So those would have some far-reaching consequences if we were to make different decisions about that. We are doing some fine tuning of the alternatives. I'm not sure if that will be one of them. But as these continue to move forward, those are excellent questions to raise.
All right, thank you, Dahlia. And thank you, Mark, for the question. Again, I don't see any other hands raised, so I do want to let folks know again, the directions are on screen. Green cursor to raise your hand, or this blue arrow cursor is showing you how to drop in questions in the Q&A. We have none in either, so maybe we'll give folks another minute to see if anyone thinks of any last questions. Okay, it looks like Dale has a question, and Dale, we will give you the ability to unmute in just a minute. Okay, you should be able to unmute now.
Thank you, and I think this has been an excellent presentation. Have you looked at the possibility of linking the study with existing museums? You have a Marine Corps Museum just recently opened in Lorton, is the U.S. Army Museum. There's potential to connect Woodlawn down to Mount Vernon, which would not have to take a route down there, but you get a bus down there. There's potential development and indoor ski resort at Alpine X at Fairfax Peak and Lorton. I mean, there's several what could be very high interest needs that people from our metro area might want to be able to get to, but and those might be destinations, maybe looking at as destinations for vacationers and the soft vacation money rather than just looking at job and employment. Have you looked at any of that?
So we have looked a little bit at it, Alpine X in particular, but some of the other areas you mentioned as well, and a couple of others that are either already slated for redevelopment or there's some plans in the works. So we've been working very closely with Prince William County staff and Fairfax County staff on looking at small area plans and other planning efforts that are underway with regard to a whole host of land uses. This preliminary analysis, as we mentioned, incorporates at this point only what was in the land use forecasts that are developed by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments and TPB. And so this first set of results does not incorporate some of those things that might be yet. But as we said, we are doing over the next month or so some additional analysis around some increased densities, some additional transit-oriented development, and some realization of some of these further out land use plans, including some of the ones that you just mentioned. So we'll be able to see from those additional analyses what the impacts of some of those, as you say, key destinations might be on ridership and on the other performance metrics that we're looking at.
Great, thank you for that answer, Dahlia. And Dale, I see that you typed in thank you on the Q&A. You're welcome. And it looks like Mark has another question. So Mark, we will You have the ability to unmute now.
Question about off-peak. I think as part of the study, you should definitely focus on, I think, focusing on the off-peak piece of this, because especially for Prince William County, because all the service is basically geared now towards peak demand. We really, if people want to take transit from Prince William County, they have a lot of options during peak time. The problem is during off-peak, we're looking at 60-minute headways to 90-minute headways for a lot of the services, or no service. And like with VRE, if you don't get on the train by 8:30, you're not getting to work or not getting anywhere. I just want to make sure that that's a point of emphasis of being able to provide this off-peak service, and what are the benefits of that, and how we can help reduce car dependency, in the region in general. Because again, as we keep expanding highways, we're not going to get anywhere. And how do we, if we can provide reliable off-peak service, I think that really has a benefit. And I think that's kind of what hopefully you can emphasize in this area, because that's something that's really lacking right now, especially in Prince William County.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. And I will say that at least 4 of the alternatives that we looked at do have that off-peak emphasis. So the 2 Metro Rail alternatives obviously would have that all-day service. The BRT as well looks at all-day service. And a big focus actually of the VRE alternative is improvements to that non-peak service. So I mentioned earlier on midday and evening service, reverse peak direction service, so service in both directions, so that folks can do exactly what you just said there. So that's a great point.
Great, thank you, Dahlia, again. And Mark, also, thank you for the question. We again have no hands up and no questions typed into the Q&A feature. We'll give folks again a few more seconds, and if we don't see any more questions come in, we will likely adjourn a few minutes early here. All right, well, no questions and no hands. So I think at this moment we can adjourn the meeting, and we really want to thank everyone for joining us today and for taking time out of your evening to be here and to share your input with us and receive the information of this study. So thank you all very much. We will drop or if you open the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and Dale's asking how many people were in this meeting. We had about 30 folks at the height of the meeting. I think a few folks have left, and now we're down to 23. You will be able to see the recording of this meeting on the project website. So if you open the chat box at the bottom, you'll see that we dropped the project website in the chat box. That way you can click on it and get to the project website. Also, there's a link to the comprehensive survey report in the chat box. And also, when you get to the webpage, if there are any additional questions that you would like to ask, there is a link on the webpage for you to submit any questions to the project team there as well. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining today. We will now end this meeting.